Welcome back to the Macintosh IIci. Last time we got this battery bombed machine to the point where it will power on and chime, but it only shows a black screen. So I asked for your help, and in the comments of the last video there were plenty of suggestions of other things to try. So let's take it apart again and see if this time we can fix it. Just to recap very quickly for anyone who hasn't seen the first video, it was this area here with all the corrosion damage. This ROM chip in particular was quite bad. We have had to install quite a few patch wires from this to its corresponding traces. But all that's been done and double checked, all that is now fine. We tested the RAM, it's all good. These 245s, they were swapped. Although ultimately it didn't make any difference, and to be honest I don't think there was anything wrong with the originals. All the electrolytics on the board were previously replaced by the last owner of this system, but we did do a bit of tidying up around here because, well, all of those old caps, they had previously leaked as well. Now when doing the work, two diodes in this position here, well, the original parts more or less fell apart. I fitted those two through-hole parts on the surface there. But one thing that's been in the back of my mind anyway is maybe those are the wrong parts. The proper parts to go on there have finally arrived, and so that's where I want to start. I want to swap those out for those. This should be relatively straightforward. I was just looking over my work here on the magnifying glass, and I'm sure some of you must have spotted this and were screaming at the screen because those three pins on the real-time clock chip, they're bridged. There are solder bridges in there and behind those pins, but not only are they bridged, it is bridged onto that trace. It comes down there and goes between those two. Is that all it needed? I don't think so, but worth a try. I know the behaviour is just the same. So one of the most common suggestions of things to try related to power and this thing. Is our power supply actually good? Okay, if I power it on here, you can see that it is generating 5 volts or just over. And there's our 12 volt. But there's nothing to suggest that just because the voltage level is correct, that the power supply here can keep up to the load of this board. For example, if I power cycle, you can see that the voltage is fluctuating there ever so slightly. Now, I don't think that would be anything to be too concerned about, but could it be an indication of excessive amounts of ripple on the 5 volt supply into this board, and that ripple current is screwing things up on us? So what we're going to do is we'll strip down the power supply and we will recap it. So how do we get into this? I can only see 2 screws, there and there. And I know Mike, the previous guy who owned this system, he was in here before. He told me he removed 5 reefer caps, and he did say that getting into it is kind of tricky. So those 2 screws are out. And yeah, how does this come apart? It almost looks as if the fan needs to come out. Yeah, there's that out of the way. Then that allows that to come off. And we are in, but what an absolute pig of a thing to take apart. But just to talk you through it briefly, once you take that top cover off and take the 2 screws out of this top board, you can sort of maneuver it out of the way to get 3 screws out of the bottom board, those 3. Once you take that one out, this bit falls out, and then to lift the bottom section of the board out, or well, to lift the whole thing out, you need to remove this clip, which goes around the power connector on the bottom side, and then on the power connector itself there are those 2 clips which you need to undo. But that gets us in, and to be honest with you, all I'm going to recap is the output side, this side of it here. I don't see any need to recap the input side. If there are any issues, it'll just be within these capacitors. Although the ones that are fitted here, well, they don't look as if they've leaked. I found replacement caps for most of these. There is one cap buried down in there that I can't make out what capacitance value it is. So we'll have to wait until we remove that. But hopefully I will have a suitable replacement in stock. One other thing that we need to deal with just very quickly though, glue. There's a lot of hot glue here has been melted onto those 3 caps, and it's down here onto those wires as well. Now those wires are going to stay, we're not removing those, so I need to free that from that. And the best way to do that really is a bit of hot air. Now I've got this turned way down, it's down to about 100 degrees. But it should be enough just to melt that glue, or just to soften it anyway, so that we can just pull those wires free from the capacitor. And there we are, that'll do it. Okay, old caps out, new caps in. Now this one here, I don't have a capacitor of exactly the same rating. Well, it's 47 UF, I do have another 47, but this is 100 volt, and the only one I have is 160 volt. This is quite a bit bigger though, and it doesn't really fit. I might just order the correct capacitor, you know. I could put it on like that, but it's not a great job. I think I would prefer to order the correct part. And because I'm just noticing there's another one here, I didn't notice that before, and it's a 2.2 UF 50 volt, and that is something I definitely don't have. So I'll need to order one for there anyway, and while getting that I may as well just get the proper part for there. And then I suppose if I need to order 2 capacitors, well, what we just do the input side as well. There are these 2 big cons here. I would expect these 2 to be fine. I don't think I've ever seen a big capacitor like that go faulty, but there are a couple of smaller ones on here, so maybe we should just replace them while we're at it. Well, it's all back together. Let's plug it in here first of all and make sure we don't get any fireworks. And granted, yes, it's not connected to the board, but the AC side of it, that will still come up. So let's see. And well, no fireworks. So from that point of view, I think it's safe enough to plug it back in. Is that enough to magically fix it? One recapped power supply? I wouldn't be so sure, but let's find out. So still get the chime. We're getting a signal, but it's just that black screen. So our 5 volt setting at 5.1, 12 volt, 11.8. That's fine. Out of interest, if I power cycle the board now, what does that 5 volt look like? Does it still float between 5.8 and 5.10? No, not as much. Previously, before the recap, that was dipping down to 5.8, 5.08 should I say, and then finally came up to 5.10, but Now it is pretty solid. Of course, all that said, 5.08, 5.1, it's not really going to make a button of difference to the operation of this board. So one of the next things that was suggested to try was the ROMs. This one here, as you might remember, was really heavily corroded, although we did remove all 4 of them and put sockets underneath. Getting these out though, well, that was a bit of a task, and the only place that I think you're going to find replacement ROMs is in another board, but they all seem to be soldered onto the board. So rather than ask someone to run the risk of damaging their 2CI board by trying to remove their ROMs, what we can do is use this ROM SIM slot. So I bought this thing. This came from a guy in France on eBay. A 2 megabyte ROM SIM. He assures me that this is pre-programmed, suitable for the 2CI. So if you put that in there and remove jumper W1, that disables those ROMs, and the Mac instead will read its ROM from this position. So that goes in there like that, and let's try it. Still just a black screen. But it did chime again, so at least we know that it is reading from that ROM. It is reading from this as well. If it wasn't, it wouldn't chime, and I would also expect it just to throw that white screen. So the other suggestion then, and let's be honest, this is probably the most likely, there's still something physically broken. For anyone that hasn't seen the first part, well, this board did once show some signs of life. It did boot just one time. I was only able to take a photo of it, and I've never been able to repeat it. But it did boot, and it did show the insert disk symbol. But why would it only do it once and never again? Well, possibly an intermittent joint somewhere. Could be a bad via. Could be a bad trace. So what I'm going to do is go over the whole board, or well, this area anyway, with my magnifying glass, and we're just going to make a note on the board with the red pen here of anywhere that looks suspicious. There's possibly a via there that might need a bit more attention. Well, yeah, there's actually quite a bit that certainly needs some further investigation. A couple of vias and quite a few traces. This whole area in here, sort of from about there to about there. Several of those traces have little dark spots on them. Now that is corrosion, but whether or not it's corrosion that has eaten right through the trace and broken it or not, well, that's what we need to test. But let's start at this end. That via there, the solder on it is partly missing. So let's just double check that we have continuity across it on this side and through to the other side. Looking at that through the camera's viewfinder, it looks fine, but under magnification it did look a little bit iffy, so let's just double check it. Okay, there's continuity coming through it, okay. And what about to the other side of the board? Yep, that's fine as well. So let's tick that one off. Let's remove the ink from the board. And let's try this point. So the solder mask here is already partly missing, but you can see just a little bit of damage to one of the traces there. But does that damage go right through the trace? Nope, that seems to be okay. Just let me go over that quickly with the fiberglass pen. And then with some further magnification, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it or not on the camera, but the trace is actually fine. There is the tiniest wee nick in it on one side of it, but it is fine. There is more such potential damage just at this point though. But any damage to the solder mask there, you can see once I've removed it, the copper underneath is perfect. No damage to it whatsoever. So just superficial there. But we do need to go right along this board and test all of this. So no more issues down here or here, but when we got to here, I found something. So there's a via here, which itself looks okay, but the trace just right beside it, well, it looked a bit crusty. Now I have exposed a little bit of the copper just beside said crustiness, and if we test it with the meter, as you can see, there's over 6 ohms of resistance through that. So I need to clean this up a bit better. We'll probably have to run a little patch wire from the via itself just down onto the trace. But the next thing I decided to do, and don't ask me why because I don't really know, but the next thing I decided to do was follow this through to wherever it went. So from that point there, it crosses the board on the underside to this point. And then from there, there's a trace that runs down to the side of the VIA on this side. The VIA chip that is, that I have removed. So there's a trace there, but the pad beside it, the pad that trace runs to, there's no connectivity. There's a break in that trace coming down there, just right where it connects to that pad. So I could have repaired that in situ, but I thought, no, let's remove the chip to get a better look at the damage. And it's just as well I did, because the trace running from pin 39 of that chip, this one here, it has several breaks on it. So just as well I removed that, or we never would have seen those. Well, the repair under the VIA, that did very little, to be honest. It's still just giving a black screen. But given that there was the damage under there, I decided just to remove all of those components at the top end of the board here. Oh well, all the ICs anyway, and especially those that have traces running under them, just to inspect, just to be sure that there was nothing else bad. And no, nothing else broken, no other issues to be found. In fact, about the only things that haven't been off this board at this stage are the 2 VLSI chips, the CPU, the FPU, the 2 bus transceivers, and this thing. All the rest of it has been off, but I cannot find anything else wrong. You'll notice that I have one of these switch boxes now. This was just given to me on a loan basis, just to test, just to be sure that, you know, our issue hasn't been a video problem. The Mac has sense pins in here, and if it doesn't sense a monitor, it will shut down its video output. But no, with this and this set correctly, it is behaving exactly the same way as it was with my homemade cable. So there is something definitely wrong on this board, but honestly, I cannot find it. And I must be at least 20 hours into the work on this. So while it pains me to say so, I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it. This board is beyond my ability to repair. That said though, I do have one other idea to possibly get a working 2CI by the end of this video, and that is to try and repair this motherboard. Now, first thing that you'll notice is that the previous owner of this, back in the day, very kindly took the battery out, and there is no damage. Everything down here is fine, no signs of corrosion whatsoever on the top side or on the bottom. Where it hasn't fared so great though is here around the capacitors. These things have spilt their guts. There is lots and lots of green. So let's get this out of the way. We'll get this down on the bench, and the first thing we'll do is give it a bath in some white vinegar. So as I'm sure you can see, it is very nasty looking. These old caps will need to come off to be replaced, but I want to give the thing a bath in the white vinegar first of all, as I said. And we're just going to dump a load of this on here. So once that's on there, we'll just work it in a bit with the toothbrush. We'll then just drain all that vinegar off. And then we'll do the same again with the IPA. That's had a chance to dry. Looking far better already, isn't it? Although a lot of those points will need reflowed. But before we do that, let's swap out all the old caps. Now I'm just going to do this in my typical sort of way. So put a bit of flux onto those points first of all. Then let me see if I can get some clean solder into them. And it absolutely stinks. Not just as bad as that Game Gear did a couple of weeks ago, but you can definitely smell the electrolytic. That telltale fishy smell. Then after that, it's just the hot air to take those off. Just clean it up with a little bit of braid. Get rid of any remaining crustiness with some IPA and cotton buds. And then I need to find replacements. 4716, 4716 and 1016. There are 3 such new capacitors there. Three done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more to do. There was a via just there that looked a bit dodgy, so I'll double check connectivity on that while we're at it. Okay, recap is done. And I did find one broken trace just there. There was a trace with a bit of heavy corrosion on it. Cleaned that off. Noticed a break in it, so it's just been patched like you seen me do last time in part 1 in this sort of area. Let's see if this IIci board works. Okay, it chimed and then it went bing 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 bing. Oh, I'm an idiot. RAM. I forgot to put the RAM in. Take 2. Black screen. Nope. Ooh. We have a video signal. Grey screen and there's a cursor up there. So that's very similar to what I seen that one time on the other board. But where's the symbol, the disc symbol with a question mark in it? I would have expected to see that. There it is. Okay. Does this work then? Let's hook up a hard drive and find out. Now this is the original hard drive out of our machine. This drive has suffered quite a bit of corrosion previously. You can see where the previous owner has tried to clean it up as much as possible. This metal here, for example, should all be like a goldy colour. But you can see it is rather heavily tarnished. So not sure if this drive will actually work, but let's hook it up and see what happens. Will not bother connecting a floppy drive just yet. I don't think you'd need the floppy drive connected to get it to boot to the hard drive. So I can hear that drive spin up. The platter has spinned up, but it doesn't sound like the drive is initializing. And certainly nothing happening on the screen here. This drive is not being accessed. I dare say this is dead. But I do have one more hard drive. I have this Quantum 80 gig drive. This is out of an old Mac IIci. This drive though does look to be in good condition, so let's connect it to this board and see if this does anything. Okay, does it work now? See, that drive spins up and that drive has initialized. The screen just flashed. And it's booting. It is booting! Oh yes! We have a working IIci. Welcome to Macintosh. Now whatever this is booting here, this was what was installed on that Mac IIci. So I assume we would have to do a complete fresh installation for, you know, this IIci. But this looks fantastic. It's booted into the operating system and this machine works. But this board, well, I did give it one more look. One of the things I tried doing was swapping the real-time clock chip from here onto, you know, our good board that's working, swapping the two chips over. And my theory behind that was that this chip was very heavily corroded. It's not just the real-time clock chip, of course. It's also the PRAM. The Macintosh requires working PRAM in order to boot. But no, swapping the chips about made absolutely no difference. That chip is fine, despite the fact it was incredibly heavily corroded. It's fine, no issue. So then I started thinking more about the symptoms. And in particular, the one time that this board did boot, it showed our grey screen with the floppy disk symbol, but it had vertical lines in it. So perhaps the issue on this board is something to do with the display system. Now there is the video DAC here, but I don't think it would be related to that. Rather, I think it would be related to the video processor, and in so much as I can tell anyway, that is integrated into this component, the RBV. So as you can maybe tell by the mess of flux around this, I decided just to try and reflow that chip, just in case, you know, it was a bad contact somewhere. You know, it did work that once. Hasn't worked since though, but you know, maybe it was a bad solder joint. But the reflow did nothing. It was at that point then that I decided just to stop. Even if I was to swap this chip for the one on the good working board. And if that did turn out to be the problem, ultimately, given the state of this board compared to the one now working on the bench, ultimately if that swap, you know, did get this working, I think I probably would have swapped it back and just kept better condition board as my main IIci. And while it is a bit of a shame considering the amount of time I have put into this, I am just going to draw a line under it and call this a parts board. If you consider just how heavily rusted and damaged this floppy drive is, this was sitting directly above where the battery was, and so this might give you some idea as to how heavy the corrosion was on the motherboard. The rust here is rather thick. The pins of all these ICs on the bottom are severely rusted. A reflow might bring them back, but it is so heavily corroded that, to be honest with you, I don't much see the point. I would expect the corrosion to have gotten into the bearings in here. In fact, they do feel a bit rough. And especially considering I have one perfectly good floppy disk drive for this machine. If you compare that with that, that gives you some idea of how bad the corrosion was. Now, all that said, I would like to get the hard drive open, because if it is just sticky heads and if we can free them up, it would be really cool, I think, if we could get the IIci to boot to this hard drive out of a IIci, just to see what's on it. And then the other thing, which you haven't seen yet, is I do have one card to put into this machine, and it is this, the Macintosh IIci cache card. This did actually come out of the other machine, the battery bombed one, and Mike, the previous owner, replaced those two capacitors. So before we do anything, before we take a look at that hard drive, why don't we put this in and see if this works? In fact, I'd be interested to know if this makes any difference in terms of how long it takes for the machine to boot into the operating system. So let's do a benchmark first of all. How long does it take this thing to boot without the cache card? Okay, I would call that booted. So let's power off, install the cache card, and let's try that again. And again, that's a booted. So comparing those times, well, yes, it did make quite a difference, didn't it? About 5.5 seconds faster booting with the cache card installed. Now, this did only cost me £20, and so very much worthwhile having. Back in the day though, when this was new, I'm sure it cost quite a bit more. Of course, where you would notice this more is in applications, and I would say in particular if you were using your IIci for any kind of productivity, especially if you were doing any graphic type design work. I'm sure this did make quite the difference. But what about this old hard drive? This is the last thing I want to try and look at. Can we get this open and see if there's anything obvious as to why it won't initialize? So it is just 6 screws around the perimeter, but there is this one here that ultimately needs to come off as well. Now it has this nut on it. I don't know if my needle nose pliers here will be able to do this or not. No, that is well and truly on there. But I am determined to get in here. So my snips, I reckon they'll get a better grip on this. Yep, starting to go. And while it has pretty much destroyed that nut, it is now off. And in fact, I don't even think that screw needs to come out. I think the only thing left that was holding it was indeed that nut. I don't think those heads should be there. And that rather polished looking track on the inside, that doesn't look right. I would expect the heads to be parked down here, off the plotter. Let me get a power supply. So let's see what it's doing when we power it up. Yeah, those heads aren't even attempting to move. Absolutely nothing. I thought we might see them twitch even a little bit. I think this drive is just dead. Well, it didn't like me doing that. Although the plotter does look a bit cleaner now. What is that on my finger? Some sort of horrible nasty dust. I wonder, is that ultimately corrosion that has worked its way in here and settled on that plotter? Well, it's definitely wrecked now, considering I've removed one of the plotters, but you can see the damage on them. I was able to get the heads freed up. They will now move back and forward, although the drive won't initialize, it won't even attempt to move these heads by itself. But you can see scores on the underside of the top plotter there, and indeed on that one. If I had to guess, I would say it is from corrosion that has got its way in here. It's settled on the surface of these plotters, and the heads have been scratching it into them, so they are destroyed. And just because I know someone will ask, here is the inside of that heavily corroded floppy drive. Lots of rust, plenty of corrosion in and around the heads. The eject mechanism still seems free enough, to be honest. So I suppose there is a chance this drive could be brought back. It's just the corrosion on the bottom side here, in particular on that component there. I am pretty sure if we touched those legs with the soldering iron, they would just disappear. Well, there we are, one working 2CI, although not quite the machine that I was hoping to get working at the start of this video. In fact, the only thing in here, the only thing about this that is from the original machine is the RAM and the power supply. That's right, this isn't even the original case, because to get that second motherboard, I had to more or less buy a second 2CI. Now, it was very much bare bones. It was just a board, in this case with another power supply. But I suppose we shouldn't complain too much really, should we? Because I now have a working Apple Mac. The other one though, that board there, well, it might yet live again, who knows? Although I have definitely had my fill with it, so it is getting moved on to the next person. Best of luck with it, Stephen. Hopefully you can get it up and running. I'm going to stick it back in its original case, include the power supply that was with this case, and you can have the original floppy drive as well. I don't much see the point in sending that original hard drive, considering it's now in multiple pieces in the bottom of my bin. But as for my journey with this machine, I suppose the question is, what's next? One thing I do need to do is reinstall this hard drive. It's running a copy of OS 7.1 here, and you can see that I have now introduced a bit of colour into the screen, but it is a mess with a whole load of previous personal files, so I would rather just wipe all that and start again. Question is though, what version of the OS should I be installing on this machine? Should we just go for 7.1 again? And then beyond that, what other software can I run on this? Indeed, what expansions could I even possibly put in here? Maybe a network card? Perhaps a better graphics card? Or is there even any point in going for something like that on a machine such as this? I suppose all I'll really ever use it for is playing a couple of games. So any recommendations for some titles that would work on this machine, well, please let me know. So that is it for now. As I said, not quite the 2CI that I was hoping to get working, but at least I do have a working example of one beside me. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.